Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Jesu, meine, Freude. We've looked at this melody a ton in the past. It translates to Jesus, my joy. Fairly straightforward chorale. A couple of interesting harmonic moments throughout. We'll just hop right into the analysis. I'll talk about those harmonic points in more detail as we get to them. So we start on D minor. We end on D major. We have one flat in the key signature. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is D minor. We have some passing tones in the lower voices here before we go to F, A, D, and A, which is 1-6. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Then we have C sharp, B flat, E, and G. This is a bit of a toss-up. You could say that this is a 7-7 chord, which is what my primary analysis is. It's C sharp fully diminished 7th. Or you could look at this A as the root of the chord, and you could analyze this as A7 over C sharp, which is 5-6-5. Either way, both chords function the same, so you could use them interchangeably, and both analyses are just as valid as each other. That takes us to D, A, D, and F. It's another D minor triad root position. We usually see 6 going to 7, 1-6 going to 7 going to 1, but usually the 7 chord is in first inversion. This doesn't really follow the bass pattern that we typically expect of that particular progression, but all in all, this middle chord is up for debate. We then have G, B flat, D, and E. E minor 7 flat 5 over G. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. And as we prepare for a perfect authentic cadence, we have A, C sharp, and E. It's a 5 chord, A major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on our tonic, D, F, A, and D. D minor root position. Next phrase gets a bit more harmonically complex. We have a half cadence here in the key of D minor, so no modulation just yet. In fact, we don't get any modulation here in the first section of this particular chorale. 1 takes us to another 1 chord, D, F, D, and A, so we don't need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the lower voices here before we get F, D, G, and B, which is G7 over F. That is not a secondary dominant. That is a 4 chord. That is a byproduct of the melodic minor scale, but very interestingly, and I think this is a bit of a hallmark of this particular melody, is this sort of like Dorian 6th, right? Because we would expect B natural in a tonal context to go to C sharp in the key of D minor, like this rising pattern, but it goes to C natural, which gives us a bit of an A minor vibe here, but the phrase ends on C sharp. So overall, I would say it's mostly D minor here. If we isolated this fragment, A minor I think would be a valid direction that you could take the analysis in, but the way that Bach contextualizes this C chord is actually very elegant and very convenient from an analysis standpoint in terms of keeping the, I guess, like the normative narrative that we would expect from the root movement. So we have 4-4-2. We would expect this to go to 7-6, and in minor, typically 7 chords are diminished, as we probably know, as you probably already know. But then we have E, C natural, G, and C natural again. So not a 7 chord that's diminished, like a leading tone 7 chord, but rather a subtonic 7th chord. So 4 still goes to 7, definitely has more of a Dorian sound than it does a minor sound, purely speaking. But all in all, the root movement from a numerical standpoint, like how the Roman numerals make it onto the page, is what we would expect. So I think that that's super cool. We also have some passing tones in the alto and the bass here before we go to G, C sharp, E, and A, which is another 4-2 chord. So 7 going to 5, not the most common chord progression, but 7 is a stable chord, and we do see it sometimes precede 5, often in sort of like a rising context here, like C natural, C sharp, and D. Usually this is in the bass, but here we're seeing it in the tenor. But after this 5 chord, we get a bit of an interesting progression here, because instead of going to D minor in first inversion like we would expect, we go to F sharp in the bass, which would take this D triad here, the D, the A, and the D here, and turn it into a major chord, which would imply that the tonic is not just major, but it has a higher function of being the dominant of 4, usually speaking, not always, but sometimes. I would say, actually I would venture to say the majority of the time. So this is a D major chord, which would imply 5/6 of 4. And with this G sharp here, we have G sharp and we have E in passing, but with A and D, it's not really an analyzable chord. It's more of like a, there's like a suspension in there or something. Like the A would be some type of non-chord tone in this E triad, I guess. That would be the way that I would look at it. But then we have another interesting chord. We have G sharp, we have F, we have B, and we have D. And that would be G sharp diminished in root position, G sharp diminished 7th, which would be 7/7 of 5. Very interesting chord progression here. I think what ends up happening is with the C sharp here in the melody, it feels like we're ending in the key of D, but there's some disagreement here between the melody and the bass, which would, I guess, kind of lead you to think that maybe we were in the key of A minor at this point, right? Because we have this idea of 5/6 of 4, like a D going to a G, going to an A. And if you wanted to analyze that in the key of A, you could, but this C sharp really wants to resolve up to D, and I'm convinced that we are still thinking in D minor terms here, despite the fact that we're preceding it with chords that would, I think, from like an elegant standpoint, they'd look better in the key of A minor, because what would this be? This would be D major, that would be a 4 chord, G sharp diminished, that'd be a 7 chord, and A would be a 1 chord. So if you do hear this as some sort of pivot to the key of A minor, that's totally valid. I think I could totally see from how an analysis could turn and go that way, but I hear the melody as the reason why the harmony has the melody is where the harmony is derived from, right? So the melody really feels like it is the point of inspiration. So when I hear D minor in the melody, it's really hard for me to justify that we've modulated at this point, even though the bass, which probably is this, I mean, it's hard to argue that it isn't the second most important factor in deriving the harmony for the rest of this chorale. But all in all, whether you think it's in the key of A minor, whether you think it's in the key of D minor like I do, that's entirely up to you. Moving on to the last phrase of the A section, we're still in the key of D minor, or we've modulated back to the key of D minor, depending on how you view this phrase ending. Because we're still in the key of D minor at this point, B flat. If we were modulating, actually let me touch on this, if we were modulating back to the key of D minor in this point, this 5 chord would be our common chord to the key of D minor, and would be functioning as not 1 anymore in the key of A, but 5 in the key of D minor. We then move to B flat, D, G, and D, which is G minor over B flat. That's 4/6, passing tone in the melody, A, D, A, and F. It's our tonic triad in second inversion. I'll neighbor tone here in the bass and a non-chord tone here in the alto. That gives us G, D, B flat, and F, which is G minor 7 in root position. That's a little subdivided chord progression in my opinion. And then we get A, D, G, and E. Kind of a cool chord here. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, implying that this is some type of 5/7 chord. B flat's a non-chord tone, and by the time we get the resolution, the G is kind of like a passing tone in this context, because we have A on the beat. So we have A, C sharp, A, and E, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position. And, oh no, the chord was already in root position, it's just removing the 7th from the chord. Or you don't need to analyze this if you feel like the 7th is still intact and part of the chord. I think that's mostly semantics at that point though, but I'm going to just analyze it as it was the 7th was removed, because it's no longer on the numbered beat and rather off of the harmonic rhythm. But the phrase ends with the tonic triad, D, A, F, and D. Perfect authentic cadence. Moving into the next phrase, we have a couple of interesting progressions here. Ends in another perfect authentic cadence, this time in the key of F. This is the first modulation in my opinion, but it might be the second one based on how you analyze the second phrase. Probably the most interesting phrase in the chorale, maybe a contender for first place if this was a competition. We start off with another D minor chord here, D, D, F, and A. It's a 6th chord in the key of F as well. It's a bit of a modulation zone, whether we modulate on the F chord or the D minor chord or this D minor chord. I think that's entirely up to you and how you hear it. A little passing tone here in the bass, literally the opposite of the melody from a range standpoint. We then go to F major, F, C, F, and A. We might be tempted to call it a tonic triad, but this passing E flat here makes me feel like this F is not just functioning like a tonic triad, but rather the dominant of 4, like we saw earlier. Very fascinating progression here in the second phrase, but we're seeing another sort of 5 of 4 situation going on, because F is also the dominant of B flat, which is the subdominant or the 4 of F, and we would expect to resolve to B flat, which the upper voices would convince us that's where we have gone, B flat, D, and B flat. But the bass is a G, which means that instead of going to 4, we're going to 2. And this is a relatively common progression in Bach. This is probably the most common example of what I've been calling a secondary deceptive progression, where in terms of B flat, this would be 5 going to 6. So in a roundabout fashion, this is a deceptive progression. So 5 of 4 going to 2. 4 and 2 also being similar because of the nature of chords that are a third apart from one another. But after 2, we do have some passing tones in the inner voices, and it does give us a chord that we can analyze. G, C, E natural, and B flat, which I'll use an arrow here just because I want to try and minimize the amount of scrunched up space that I'm using. But this would be C7 over G, which is a 5-4-3 chord. 2 wants to go to 5. We would expect to go to 1 here, and the upper voices, F and A, would make us think that we were going to 1, but again, we're not going to 1. It's a deceptive progression. We're going to 6, D, D, F, and A, with a passing 7th in the bass. So 2 consecutive, or I guess sort of linked deceptive progressions, one in the primary context in the key of F, the other in a secondary context in the key of B flat. But after our 6th chord, we go to B flat, D, F, and G. 6 typically does want to go to 2 via the cycle of falling fifths. Not always. 6 is a very flexible, stable chord, so we see it go all over the place, but via the cycle of falling fifths, which I talk about a ton in my videos, 6 wants to go to 2. And we know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. That takes us to 5, C, C, E, and G, good old C major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on F major, F, A, C, and F. Moving on to the next phrase, we have a bit of an interesting situation here when compared to the second phrase. So when we look at the second phrase, I'm fairly convinced that we are in the key of D minor just by virtue of the fact that the melody really feels like that C sharp wants to resolve, and the A does not really feel like, by the time we arrive on it, it does not feel like it's a tonic chord based on the way that I hear it. You might disagree with me. To me, it does not sound like a tonic chord. It sounds like a dominant chord, and it really doesn't sound like we've made the modulation to the key of A, even though the bass and the other supporting voices might seem like they're doing. I think it's a valid analysis. It just depends on how you hear it, depends on how your relationship exists with the harmony. But in this case, I do think we modulate to the key of A. And if you view this chorale as one where there is symmetry between the phrases, or symmetry not between the phrases. Well, yes, there's symmetry between the phrases, but what I meant to say was symmetry between the sections. This being the second section, and the fact that A is sort of like an arrival point, and in the second phrase of the A section, we have a phrase that arrives on A as well. Maybe there is some symmetry between the two of them. All in all, I think it's a bit of a toss-up. Like I said, it's very possible that this could be In this case, an imperfect authentic cadence, but I think that it's a half cadence, and in this case, it is an authentic cadence. Regardless, we do get a mid-phrase modulation, interestingly enough. At least it sounds like we move to the key of C major, if anything, just very briefly, as a means of giving us, I guess, a smoother pivot to the key of A, because C is closer to A than F. And I don't know, there's no reason why Bach couldn't go directly to F based on, you know, just the modulation, or just the styles of modulation that we see, because F and A, or F major and A minor more specifically, are adjacent to one another on the cycle of fifths. I just feel like we modulate to C, and it just makes a little bit more sense from a meandering standpoint to create a more closely related link along the modulation chain. Anywho, F, A, C, and A is another F major chord, and before we get this B natural, I do believe this this F major chord is operating as 4 in the key of C as well. And then we have a bit of an interesting chord here too. We have E, G, F, and B. G and E are not really, I think they're accented non-chord tones, and really the chord that's being implied here uses this D and this F, which would make this B diminished over D, which would be 7-6, 4-7 being a very normative progression, sort of like the kindred spirit to going to 5. And that does take us to 5, or sorry, not to 5, to 1-6. E, G, E, and C, with some passing tones in the upper voices this time. We then have another F major chord, F, A, C, and A. It's 4. And then we go to a bit of an interesting chord here. We have D, no, that is a B, B, A, F, and D, which would be some type of 7/2 diminished chord, but with this G sharp, I think there's a bit of a interesting thing going on here, and we have a bit of a zone. And actually, I'm going to walk this back real quick. You could analyze this as 7/7 in the key of C major, but I really do feel like this A is operating as a 7/6 suspension, and this is actually G sharp fully diminished over B. So that would be a 7/6/5 chord in the key of A minor. And in the key of A minor, this 4 chord is also 6. In my notes, I analyzed this as a 2 chord because I misread this for a D chord, because I just misread my clefs. If you do not already know, I am dyslexic, and I know this is a very minor detail. Anyone probably could have made that mistake, but all in all, a lot of preparation goes into these videos from my notes, and some things slip through the cracks, and this is something that just gets caught in the rereading of the material. And pitch took me quite a long time to learn how to read, at least to the level of proficiency I have now. Regardless, you know, the final draft being the one that gets made in the video, I catch little mistakes like that, and the analysis ends up getting better. So 6 going to 7, fairly normative progression, makes sense. That takes us to A minor, C, A, E, and C. It's a 1/6 chord. We have some passing tones, or actually we have one passing tone, a neighbor tone, and an anticipation here where we have D, A, F, and B. It's a B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is just 2-6-5. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. And then we have E, A, E, and B. Another 4/3 suspension over a dominant chord. We see that all the time in Bach with 4/3 suspensions over root position dominance, especially a little delayed passing 7th here in the alto. And then we cadence not on 1 minor, but 1 major, which is the really big sort of connecting point between our second phrase and the second phrase of the B section. All in all, I think this is a really strong argument in favor of this being an authentic cadence in terms of drawing some type of parallelism between the two. But to me, it feels like we've established a modulation and further away from the cadence. But yeah, this one's a bit of a toss-up. This one's very clearly a modulation to the key of A, at least earlier in the phrase, that is. And I do think, however, we use this A in a similar fashion that if you felt this was a modulation, you would have analyzed it. It sort of aligns with the key of D minor into the next phrase and becomes the 5 chord. When we cadence in the key of the minor dominant, or when Bach cadences in the key of the minor dominant, it's not uncommon for him to finish the phrase with a major tonic triad, which then turns into the dominant of the tonic key. We see it with quite a bit of frequency in Bach, and it's really one of the only sort of key relationships that he does that's really, yeah, this is a perfect authentic cadence, but in terms of the overall key structure of the of this chorale in particular, it's functioning more like a half cadence than it is as an authentic cadence. The only reason why it's an authentic cadence is because we've modulated to A, but really it's functioning more as the dominant in the key of D. Otherwise, why didn't he just cadence on an A minor chord? Regardless, we do go to the key of D minor to conclude the chorale, ends in a perfect authentic cadence. 5 takes us to 1, D, F, D, and A, tonic triad. Passing tones in the lower voices, we're going to see some progressions that sort of evoke the same feel as the first phrase here. We have F, A, D, and A. That's just our tonic triad in first inversion with the neighbor tone here. I know this sort of looks like a suspension. I guess technically speaking, this could be a 6/5 suspension over the bass. Not really a suspension that I take note of too often because it's a consonant suspension. It's really the dissonant suspensions that help dispel a lot of the harmonic confusion that might occur between two chords based on the voices that are part of the figure. But afterwards we see some melodic minor here. B, D, D, and G. That's G major over B, 4/6. Again, not a secondary dominant, but part of the melodic minor scale. C sharp in the bass here. A is a non-chord tone. E is a non-chord tone. With that G there, we have A7 over C sharp, which is 5/6/5. Very common harmonization of the melodic minor scale here. Also common to see it as a subdivided progression over one beat. And then we conclude this little fragment here with D minor, D, A, E, and F. This E is like a suspension or an accented non-chord tone, kind of like a 9/8 suspension. Very common over D minor chords, but also just common over tonic triads and root position as well. And then we see another G sharp in the bass here, which just brings extra attention to the A. We see a lot of G sharp going on in the second phrase here, which is sort of like, I feel like the hallmark of this particular chorale from an analytical standpoint. But we have G sharp, B, D, and E. Secondary dominant, it's a 5/6/5 of 5, E7 over G sharp. We know that E is also the dominant of A, which is our dominant in the key of D minor. E is a, sorry, I just said that without counting. Yeah, E is a chord tone. C sharp is not a chord tone. B is a chord tone. That takes us to A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. So this is really like the first secondary dominant. Oh, actually, no, I take that back. We do have a secondary dominant earlier that resolves the way we would expect, but this is also kind of functioning similarly here where we're tonicizing 5, but instead of cadencing on 5, we're cadencing on 1. We also have a passing 7th here, but the majority of the secondary dominants we have in this chorale are not succeeded by the chord that we would expect. In this case, we do get a resolution we would expect, and then we cadence on 1 major, as we often do in minor chorales. I feel like I say that in the majority of the videos. D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in major. Bach often ends his minor chorales with a major tonic triad. I feel like it has more so to do with his relationship with major chords and them having more of a final quality, like a conclusive quality to them. But it could just be that he wanted to end the chorale on an uplifting note as well. Also could just be a convention or a stylistic thing that he does. It's just not, he's not 100% consistent with it. He's just mostly consistent. But regardless, that's today's chorale. All in all, this progression here at the end of the second phrase is probably, as I talked about it a ton in this chorale, very interesting, definitely something to take note of. We have a mid-phrase modulation here where we start in C and then go to A minor after technically technically starting the phrase in the key of F, even though it's only one beat. And secondary deceptive progression here, 5 of 4 going to 2. Fairly typical in Bach, not the the most exciting thing to write home about, but if you're new to harmony, it's fairly it's an interesting find. As if you weren't as comfortable with harmony and you learned that secondary dominants are supposed to resolve a particular way, you might feel like maybe there was a typo in the score, or you might not feel as confident analyzing it that way, but rest assured they do occur in the in Bach's writing, at least. That's pretty much all I had to say about this particular chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.